stray away from my notes. I might look at them for a time or two, but I'm going to go over an obscene amount of history in the next couple of hours. I do have a built-in break, but feel free to get up, move around. That's not going to bother me. That's not going to distract me. Again, thank you all for being here on this beautiful summer afternoon. We don't get too many of these. Again, Christy Clark-Pujara, please just feel free to call me Christy. I teach at UW-Madison, and I teach slavery. I teach introduction to slavery, U.S. history of slavery, capitalism, and slavery, African Americans in the age of revolution, African American history to 1900. I jokingly tell people when I get in the 20th century, I get a little shaky. So I'm what they call an early Americanist. My first book was about how the business of slavery shaped the experience of slavery in Rhode Island. So I actually specialize in northern slavery. We get really narrow, but teach really broadly. Right now I'm working on a book about people of African descent in what becomes Wisconsin from the French colonial period through the American Civil War. And since a lot of people here are Wisconsin folks teaching in Wisconsin schools, remind me to tell you about a couple of really accessible articles. A colleague of mine at UW-Platteville just wrote an article about slaveholding in the state, and I recently wrote an article about the fight for black suffrage in the state in the 19th century, and they're both in the Wisconsin Magazine of History, so very accessible. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is really talk around sugar. And so I'm going to start with kind of a big history of slavery as an institution throughout the world, and then focus really briefly on West Africa and Europe, because those are the two worlds that collide in the New World, and so their understandings of slavery. And the sugar plantations in the Caribbean, or some people refer to as the West Indies, becomes the model for the plantations that emerge in North and South America. So we actually have very few sugar plantations in North America, because there's really only around the Delta area in Louisiana and Mississippi that you have the right temperature to grow sugar. Most of the plantations that we'll see in the Americas are rice, tobacco, and then much later on, cotton. And so I'll be talking around sugar. Okay. So one of the things that I do with all of my classes, and really anytime I teach or give a public lecture, or actually when I teach, is I go to bell hooks. Some of you are nodding because you're familiar with this. I start my classes this way. The academy is not paradise, but learning is a place where paradise can be created. The classroom, with all its limitations, remains a location of possibility. In that field of possibility, we have the opportunity to labor for freedom, to demand of ourselves and our comrades an openness of mind and heart that allows us to face reality, even as we collectively imagine ways to move beyond boundaries, to transgress. This is education as a practice of freedom. So I always tell my students, you know, I don't teach history because I like to live in the past. I teach history because it explains my present. And that what we're doing is not about learning a bunch of trivia and facts about the past, but understanding how and why our world looks the way it does right now and operates the way it does right now. That history is about the present. History is what makes us human. I always give them a challenge. I say, I will give you 10 free points on the final if you can explain to me in a substantive manner who you are without any historical reference. So you can't use any terms that require a knowledge of history. You can't say that I'm an American, or I'm a Christian, or I'm Jewish, or I'm Muslim, or I'm of German descent, because none of that means anything without a historical frame. And I've yet to come across a student who says, I am a body of cells. Okay? That they have an identity, and their entire identity is wrapped up in history, what history tells us about those terms. And then I go to Frederick Douglass. I think one of the difficulties in teaching the history of slavery in this country, and I think actually throughout the Americas, is people feel like if you highlight the nation's sin, it's somehow disrespectful, that it's a problem, that it's unpatriotic. And I go to Frederick Douglass. No, I make no pretension to patriotism. So long as my voice can be heard on this or the other side of the Atlantic, I will hold America to the lightning scorn of moral indignation. In doing this, I shall feel myself discharging the duty of a true patriot. For he is a lover of his country who rebukes and does not excuse its sins. It is righteousness that exalts the nation, while sin is a reproach to any people. I like to think about it as capital P patriotism. And what I mean by that is, I see a lot of lowercase patriotism, like a bumper sticker, flag t-shirts, and pajamas, and board shorts, and flags hanging from houses. I do all of those things. If you had seen my children on the 4th of July, they were decked out in flag clothing, right? With a sparkler in one hand and a flag in the other. But for me, it's problematic if that's where your patriotism stops, right? If your patriotism isn't wrapped up in, do my fellow humans and citizens have access to freedom, liberty, and justice, right? That to highlight the sins of the nation is not to be traitorous. It's to be a patriot, right? The United States has this impossible ideal, right? That there's going to be freedom, liberty, and justice for everyone. That has never been true, and it will never be true, right? But our greatness is in striving for that impossible. That each generation puts on its back to get a little bit closer to that impossible goal of freedom, liberty, and justice. You read the Declaration of Independence, it's absurd. It says a pursuit of happiness, right? That everybody should have the right to that. That it's those ideals, those impossible ideals that make the country great. That we should never be content in the present or content about the past. That it's always about moving forward. What can we do to get closer to those impossible goals? How can more and more people have access to freedom, liberty, and justice? And if you read Douglass, you can see that that's where his patriotism is, right? He is incredibly hard in the United States of America, calls it out at every opportunity, and he does it out of patriotism, out of the expectation that the country strive to live up to these impossible goals. So I think sometimes when people think that, let's talk about slavery, well, let's forget about that. That's embarrassing. That's a dark part. That's dragging down the country. It's not. It's who we are. And if we don't face who we are, we can't address our problems in the present. Right? And if we can't get comfortable talking about this original sin, we'll never move forward. So I have made a career out of criticizing the United States of America, and I do it on camera. So, there are some universal characteristics of slavery, right? So, it pains me to do this because I have to be so general, but I just don't have, 16 weeks to take you through it. So, since antiquity, varieties of enslavement existed throughout the world. So if we can get in a time machine and go back to any of the 7 continents where people live, societies big and small, until very recently, and I mean within the last few hundred years, forms of bondage existed everywhere. It was one of the few things that all human communities had in common. Whether we're talking about Asia, Europe, Africa, or the Americas, there were unfree people. People who do not benefit from their own labor, who are not in charge of their own reproduction, who were exploited, who were abused and misused and mistreated and considered outsiders. This generally was a space that was reserved for punishment or for outsiders. And by outsiders, I mean someone outside your language group, outside your religious belief, outside your social structures. Right? People who didn't dress like you and eat like you, So outsiders, people without kin, people without family. We have really two types of societies when you think about slaveholding. The first is a slave society. A slave society means that slave labor is at the center of the economy. Right? What institution is the biggest employer in Madison, Wisconsin? Not Epic. University and Commonwealth.
The government.
Right? The government, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're a capital city, right? Or if you think about a city, has anybody ever been to Iowa City, Iowa? There's about 100,000 people. That's where I got my master's and PhD from. The university is the biggest employer there, right? And students account for almost a third of the population. If the University of Iowa left Iowa City, what would happen to Iowa City?
Collapse.
It would collapse. Just like if the capital disappeared here and the University of Wisconsin disappeared, what would happen to the economy? Right? It would take a nosedive. So in a slave society, slave labor is the center. If you remove slave labor from those societies, it collapses. Right? That's the situation in places like Jamaica and Haiti. Right? Slave labor is at the center. And then there are societies with slaves. So slave labor is important, but it's not central. So somebody mentioned Epic. Epic is a huge employer here. Has almost single-handedly driven up the rent prices in downtown Madison, right? Or the buses going in and out. If Epic left, that would hurt Madison, but would it destroy its economy? Verona? That's another story, right? Right? It's important, but it wouldn't destroy its economy, right? And so that's how they usually, in most places in the world, were societies with slaves. We've actually had very few slave societies that existed anywhere. You got ancient Egypt, Greece, these are slave societies. The Americas become slave societies. So most places in the world are societies with slaves. Slave labor is important, but it's not central. Now I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about West African slavery, because most enslaved people were bought from West Africa. They were interior peoples who were sold in West Africa. It's really important not to think of Africa as a monolith. Mm-hmm. Africa is the biggest continent and the most diverse continent by any measure. If you're talking about languages spoken, types of society, so matriarchal, patriarchal, right? If you're talking about foods that people eat, in some regions of Africa, it's potato-based. Other regions, it's bread-based. Other regions, it's rice-based, right? If you're talking about religions practiced, right? The term Africa is a modern one, right? And many times when you speak to people from Africa now, they identify locally, right? It's a fairly new thing to think about Africa as a monolith. And you often hear people speaking of Africa as if it's like a state or a nation, as if it isn't incredibly diverse, right? And so I'm only going to speak really briefly and give you some vague generalizations about how slavery operated in West Africa, basically from the Bight of Benin down to the Congo. So, there were two types of slavery in West Africa. There were domestic slaves and there were captive slaves. Right? And this distinction is important. Domestic slaves could not be sold except for serious criminal offenses. They had their own plots of lands or right to a portion of the fruits of their labor. They could marry. Their children had rights of inheritance. And if born of one free parent, they often acquired that status. So we want to think similar to the European serf. Captive slaves were almost always vulnerable for sale, being exchanged for goods as well as serving as currency in a number of transactions such as marriage payments. So you have domestic slavery and captive slavery. this is going to change, and there are really three widely held views about slavery in West Africa. The institution of slavery was endemic in and a natural feature of West African society. Consequently, when Europeans arrived in West Africa with a demand for people, West African kingdoms were able to quickly organize and export trade in people in an ever-increasing scale. Two, the external demands for labor, which led to a great growth of the institution of slavery in West Africa, corrupted indigenous societies. And three, the external demand for enslaved people became so considerable that there was a disastrous effect on its population. The most recent scholarship supports a combination of all these, right? That economic and commercial slavery and slave trading were not natural features of West African society, that it was a society with slaves. Okay? But domestic slavery was, and captive slavery was not unusual. Consequently, West African societies were positioned to develop as a slave system and trade that eventually met the needs of a growing system of foreign trade. So what might be termed a slave economy was generally established in the West and Central Sudan by about 1515 and spread to the coast around Senegal and Lower Guinea by the 17th century. Right? And so they were positioned to support and export trade. And it's also important to remember, sometimes you'll hear somebody saying something like, Africans sold themselves into slavery. This is a profoundly ignorant statement. And what I mean by that is, that would be like me saying, a bunch of white people killed each other during World War I and II. As if the English didn't see themselves as distinct from the Germans, and the Germans didn't see themselves as distinct from the French, and the French didn't see themselves as distinct from the Italian. Like, that's absurd, right? So if I were to just collapse all that, just a bunch of random white people killing each other for no reason, right? The African nations and kingdoms saw themselves as distinctly different. You don't speak like me, you don't look like me, you don't dress like me, you don't eat like me, you don't believe like me. You're different, right? An outsider might say, oh, they look the same. It's like I might just look at a group of white people like, you guys are all related, right? Because you all look the same to me, right? So what you have is coastal nations in West Africa selling their enemies, right? People that they have disliked for millennia, right? And so the people that are sold in the slave trade, most of them, I mean, you do have people who are captured and kidnapped, but most of them are captives of war, being sold by their enemies, who see this as a win-win. I get rid of you and I get paid for you. Right? And this is not surprising in human societies. We fight. We always have, we always will. Now, Europe, Western Europe specifically, only the Romans in ancient Rome have a slave system that was similar to those that are going to be established in the Americas. They needed large numbers of people solely devoted to agriculture in order to feed the large urban populations in their empire. Slavery thrived in Rome as long as the Roman Empire survived. Slavery as a major economic institution collapsed with the barbarian invasions from the 5th to the 8th centuries as a result in the decline of the urban markets. The breakdown of long-distance trade and increase in self-sufficiency of agriculture all created a situation in which slave labor was no longer efficient, and the peasant agricultural labor predominated again. Slavery was reduced to the level of the household and domestic tasks. So for most of the history in Europe, like in Africa, you have societies with slaves. Right? So slave labor exists, is there, but it's not central to the economy. Right? I'm going to move away from my notes because it's going to take you too long. Okay, some general characteristics of European slavery. People know the difference between a serf and a peasant. It's the difference between a serf and a peasant.
Isn't a serf attached to the land?
Yes. They can't leave the land, right? And it's both oppressive and protective at the same time. Meaning, because they can't leave the land, if there's a new lord, that lord can't kick them off, but they also can't leave that land, right? And so they have a relationship with that land, and they are entitled to a portion of the fruits of the labor of that land, right? And then you have peasants that go from fiefdom to fiefdom looking for a place to survive, to live, right? Because feudal Europe, right, this is before nation states, feudal Europe is a very hierarchical society. You have about 3% of the population owning everything, then the church, and then a bunch of peasants. It's always funny at Renaissance fairs. You never see any peasants. You only see the 3% of the population, right? The royalty, the military, and church officials, right? When the vast majority of the population are peasants and serfs. Okay. The feudal system puts the lord in charge, and then the lord is underneath the king, right? And this is the labor system that predominates most throughout Europe, right? So both West Africans and Europeans come to the Americas with ideas of what slavery is, how it functions, and what it looks like. What it becomes in the Americas is something different and new. But before I get to that, I'm going to talk about the Atlantic Plantation Complex. The Atlantic Plantation Complex. I spend a lot of time on this because, I'm not today, but I often spend a lot of time on this when I teach because so much of American history is taught in a vacuum. As if what happened in North America wasn't part of this huge global system, right? This is really the introduction to globalization, right? I mean, before this you have the Ottoman Empire, but when we're talking about connecting all 7 continents, it's the Atlantic Plantation Complex. So what is it? The Atlantic Plantation Complex is an economic system. So it's an idea and it's a real thing. So for the first time, groups of people who don't know each other, maybe never see each other or talk to each other, invest in an enterprise together, expecting a return on that investment. And what are they investing in? Sugar. We've all had sugar. You don't ever need to have a commercial or advertisement for sugar. Why? Because once you have it, you want it. You ever watch your kid the first time they have sugar, like a piece of chocolate or something, like your eyes light up. Very rarely will you come across somebody who doesn't like sugar, right? And now we're to a point where it's in everything. It's in bread, it's in condiments. If you try to go a day without sugar, it's really difficult. It's usually only like vegans that can accomplish this, right? And I don't mean natural sugar, I mean refined sugar, right? So sugar grows naturally in some places throughout the world, and it grew naturally in the Mediterranean, right? And people get a little bit of taste of this, and they want it, and they're going to know that everybody wants it. So you have these plantations that grow up in the Mediterranean, and a plantation simply means a large planting. So you're going to have a large planting of sugarcane, and you are going to have a bunch of unfree people work it. And this is a variety of people. These are indentured servants, some people are slaves, and they are working these large plantations. They are usually owned by a group of investors or a colonial enterprise of some kingdom. And and it's operating on a large scale. Like, you're not growing sugar for the community there. You're growing sugar so you can export it somewhere else, right? And so it's a real thing and it's an idea. So you have them first emerging in the Mediterranean in the 11th century.
Where? The northern coast of Africa, southern coast of Europe, both?
Yes. So in and around the Mediterranean. And then off the coast of Africa, right? And this is basically following colonization once you get off the coast of Africa. then in South America and the Caribbean, and finally in North America. And where does sugar grow the best? In places like Jamaica and Haiti, where it's warm and hot and wet year-round, and you can constantly produce it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that because you're going to hear about that tomorrow. I'm going to focus more on North America. And like I said before, there are very few places you can grow it. But the Atlantic Plantation Complex introduces economic principles and structures that are still with us today, where you have a boss at the top, managers and supervisors, and workers, right? That's how most of our businesses now are structured, right? You got a CEO and a CFO, and then you have a series of managers, a series of supervisors, and then workers. That is a plantation structure, right? That we now just use in our economy. And I went through all of this, so. But to give you an idea how it moves, right? So it's an idea and it's a real thing, right? It also allows us to think about colonization and industrialization in a different way. That it's part of a global enterprise, that it's not happening in a vacuum in any particular place. Right? And the sugar is being produced to go elsewhere. What accompanies the Atlantic Plantation Complex, comes after it, is the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade was the largest movement of peoples the world had ever seen to that point. It was literally unprecedented that many people had moved that quickly. People have been always moving around the world, but that many people moving that quickly, right? You have both Africans and Europeans on equal footing in most of the trade. Right? So Europeans are approaching West African kingdoms and nations to buy slaves. How do we know this? We have the paperwork, because this is a business. I can tell you what was on a ship in 1717, right? Because I have the manifest. I can tell you how many people survived, how many people were taken on, what foods were eaten on most days, whether or not there was a case of measles, right? There is something called the Slave Trade Database. And I'll just show it to you really quickly, because I think this is a source that all students, like to play with. And I think that this is true elementary school on up. So a few decades ago, different historians who were, no, this is not it, who were all studying slavery, the transatlantic slave trade database is what it is. No, that's not that one either. Oh, there's been so many. I'm going to find this. Yes, this was it. Just change the interface. So, the slave trade database collects slave trade information from everywhere. So a few decades ago, you get a bunch of historians who have been studying slave trading in different areas saying, what if we got everything together, right? All of the sources. And what if we turned it over to mathematicians, right? I'm being simplistic, right? They could then give us estimates, right? And so there's something like 36 or 38,000 documents, but it grows. So as new information is found out, goes to the slave trade database. So you can do maps from, how many slave ships left from Providence, Rhode Island in 1760. How many slave ships docked in Jamaica in 1800, right? And so we know a lot about what was happening on these slave ships. To give you a sense of where people are going, you can see North America is not the hot spot, right? North America is a backwater. It's not that important because white gold, as it was called, was in the West Indies. Like, that's the primary market. And then South America, where there is gold to be mined and exotic fruits to be harvested. Those are the gold mines, right? North America is a backwater. North America receives the least amount of slaves in the Americas, but it's going to end up with the largest slave population. And if I forget to tell you why, remind me at the end, right? And so it's important to understand that this was part of a large global system. There wasn't just this trade from West Africa to North America. But so much American history is tunnel vision that we think that all of this is just happening in a vacuum, when really what's happening is colonists in North America are looking at what has already happened in the West Indies, what has already happened in South America. This is just kind of another picture of where people are coming from. Most African Americans trace their heritage back to about 6 or 7 places in West Africa, in which they disembarked from. This is from an insurance company. It's called Tight Packing. Right? You may have seen this before, but these are how people are transported. It takes no imagination to think through the horrors of the slave trade. And many people focus on the Middle Passage. And rightly so, because this is where a good chunk of people died. And as you can see, it's clear why. We have no modern bathrooms. Right? But before you ever get on a ship, you have about 1.8 million people dying. If we think about the slave trade in total, the estimate is anywhere from about 10 to 16 million. Those are conservative estimates of people that were enslaved from the 15th century through the 19th century. So you have to march to the coast, right? From whatever interior nation you're from, or kingdom, right? Not nations, right? And then there's a wait along the coast. And then there's the Middle Passage. And then there's surviving the first year. The people who survived the march to the coast, the wait along the coast in barracoons, these big slave castles, and then the Middle Passage, and then the first year in the Americas, are like immune system rock stars by that point, right? Because people like myself were gone on the march to the coast. And I say that in the sense of things like, I'm nearsighted and clumsy, right? And so like the chances that you may, and I have allergies, right? And the chances that you may, like I say that kind of jokingly, but that's a real thing. A lot of people died on the march to the coast. A lot of people died on that wait along the coast. And then you have more death in the Middle Passage. And then even more, and then more death in the first year. Why so much death in that first year? Because you're encountering a new disease environment, right? And so the people who survive all of this are immune system rock stars. Again, the horrors of the slave trade take no imagination. So how do you do this? You speak the language of violence. We have thousands, and I say we, I'm talking about historians, thousands and thousands of letters from slave ship captains. And they talk about the first thing you do when you get a group of people aboard a ship. Some ships are carrying 60 people, other ships are carrying 400 people. Is that you have to establish dominance. And how do you do that? With a bevy of people who speak different languages. Because slave ship captains learned very quickly You don't go to one place and fill up your ship. You're going to have some problems because those people can talk to each other and plan. You need to coast up and down and get different people from different places, right? And so that you would literally have a motley group, right? So people who were different religions, came from different social systems, maybe were enemies, didn't speak each other's languages, right? So you get an ethnic mix. So how do you relate that you are going to do what you're told? And that means following like pointing and gestures. You do some horrific act of violence. You do something like drown someone in a tub of urine and feces in front of everyone, or chop off somebody's arm, because violence is a language, right? So this wasn't like random violence. This is thoughtful violence, because that's how you control a large group of people who are freaked out. Where am I? Where am I going? And who are these people with white skin? Because I've never seen people like that before, right? The few accounts we do have, the first-hand accounts of people who were on slave ships, thought white people were ghosts. They thought they were being taken to be eaten. They had seen people who looked like that. Many of them had never seen the ocean before. And they're on these structures, and they're like, what is happening? Right? It's akin to an alien invasion. Like, where am I going, and who are these people? And so, the violence was not random, it was not happenstance, it was thoughtful. And working on these slave ships was horrible. If you look at the mortality rates of sailors, they rival that of captives, right? Because there is military-style hierarchy on these ships, right? Many of the people that are on the ships are at the bottom of the social rung. They end up working on a slave ship. So these are Europeans. Many of them don't want to be on these slave ships. They're dependent. You don't get paid until the end of the voyage. The captain's cut is topped off by percentage usually. So how many captives do you deliver alive and healthy? So you're actually more concerned about enough people arriving alive and relatively happy than you are the crew, right? Because that's where your percentage comes from. Okay. The captain and his first mate have a monopoly on firepower. They also are wearing whips. Right? These are horrible jobs, cleaning the hold. Right? There are just large buckets for people to defecate in. And there are things like force feedings going on, because again, you want to keep as many people alive as possible. The horrors of the slave ship can't really be overstated. Sharks follow these because they're throwing off dead people, and so on, right? Rebellion was common. When you read the letters of captains, unless there was a death of many sailors, they talked about it as if it wasn't that big of a deal. They tried to rise again today. Some people tried to undo their shackles. And so this is just a drawing of a slave revolt. Very few were successful. Amistad was one of the few successful slave revolts, and then they sailed into New York. But they happened pretty regularly. Enslaved women were often involved. Women and children were not chained below deck, usually. They usually had the run of the midship and board ship because they weren't seen as direct threats in the way that men were. So they were manacled both at the ankles and the wrist. And women usually were not, and so they would, smuggle knives and that kind of thing to men below the hold. It's surprising to me, and I think anybody who spends any time studying this, that more people didn't just go stark raving mad on these ships. That they started to form communities and teach each other their languages. I want to put the U.S. in context, right? So it receives 3% of all slaves transported, but ends up with the highest number of people of African descent by 1860. They are late and minor sellers and buyers in the Atlantic slave trade as a whole. And it is Northerners that dominate the slave trade. In particular, it's Rhode Islanders that dominate the slave trade. Of every 10 slave ships that left North America, 8 left from Rhode Island. Right? It was their economy. And I'll talk a little bit more about the business of slavery later. So this is just a picture of the Newport's port.
I haven't
Yes.
heard that before, and I'm trying to chew on what you're saying. So say that again, please. The majority of the slaves were in the North? Not
No.
majority of slaves,
The majority of the slave traders.
traders.
Yeah. So the people who built a slave ship, sailed to West Africa, sailed to the West Indies, and then back to North America were Northerners, in particular Rhode Islanders.
Thank you.
A unique slave system develops in the Americas. There's a few things that make it stand out. First, it's just the scale of both enslavement and death. 10 to 14 million trafficked, 5 to 7 million die in the process. So we're talking about from the point of capture, so the walk to the coast, the way along the coast, the middle passage, and the first year. It also is the creation of race-based slavery. So now in America, in North America, if you ask most people to close their eyes and think of a slave, they think of a black person. How did this happen? Slavery had existed in all kinds of forms all over the world. If we go back to ancient Greece, we see enslaved people of every shade. Same was true in ancient Egypt. Right? How does it get associated with dark skin? With brown and black folks? How does that happen? It was legislated. It was a weird thing that happened. That's weird. That one group of people is isolated as acceptable slaves. And it was an artificial process that was created through the law. And I'm actually going to walk you through it in a few slides. It's also strange because it's this perpetual, habitual slavery. You're a slave, your kids are slaves, your grandkids are slaves, your great-great-grandchildren, and it's never going to change. Slaves are going to be born from here on out, and all of those people are going to be slaves, and there's no way out of it. Like, a few people are able to negotiate with their owners, but in the system as a whole, there's nothing you can do to get out of it. There isn't an amount of time that you spend that you then are absorbed into that society and treated like everyone else. You are going to be a forever outsider for always, and so will all of your progeny. It's an absurd system. And it's also this idea that people are pure chattel. I can mortgage you, I can insure you, you can be collected as collateral, I can extend a line of credit on a person. So people as chattel. So often when we think about slavery in the world, what makes slavery in the Americas so notorious, and when I'm saying the Americas, I'm talking about North America, the islands in between, and South America, is the preposterousness of a system that the world had never seen. Not of that scale, of associating it purely with a skin color, rather than like you're a religious outsider, you're a social outsider, you're a linguistic outsider. No, it's just going to be skin. The color of your skin and who your mother is going to determine whether or not you are in this system forever. And people are going to be purely commodified. Although the people resist that commodification. This is a famous picture of three generations of enslaved people that was taken out after the Civil War. Let's take actually, am I halfway through? I'm not. So, can we take a break in about 10 minutes? Can you remind me? All right. So, European invasion and settlements. So now I'm going to focus in on what happens in North America. North America is a late story, right? When is the first successful European colony in North America? It's pop quiz time. Jamestown, 1607, right? you already have slave societies in the Caribbean by this point. You already have slave societies in South America at this point that are race-based, right? They're going to be a little bit different. The spectrum of racism is a little wider and more complicated. You know, they have like 14 ways you can be black versus the one that's going to develop in North America. I'm being facetious and honest. So North America is late, right? There's already slave societies in the West Indies. There's already slave societies in South America because the English are late to the game, right? So who's leading colonization in the Americas?
Iberian.
It's the Portuguese. It's the Spanish, right? And then the French come. The English are late, which is why they end up with North America, right? The backwater. We're not used to thinking of ourselves that way. But that was the case. The prime real estate where you can grow sugar has been taken, right? And so you have, and it's because the English crown is poorer than the rest of the crowns at that point. That is going to change, but at that point. So in the Chesapeake, that's Virginia, Maryland, Delaware. You have the English, and the cash crop is tobacco. So it's important to remember that colonization was an economic project. You know, we have such at least what I was taught in school, but my students still tell me they're being taught is, the very first thing you learn about colonization is Puritans fleeing religious persecution, right? So we don't even start with the first colony, which is weird, right? Right? We don't go chronological. We go with the New England colonies that were like smaller and less important. We don't go with Virginia, like the center of everything, because then you have to immediately talk about slavery, and we don't want to do that. So let's talk about the Puritans, which very few Americans can trace any ancestry back to, but we all wore those belt buckles and the hat. This is about myth making, right? And the stories we choose to tell about ourselves. It's not saying that story is untrue, but it's a random and small story to tell in the scheme of things, right? Why not start with Virginia, right? So 1607, and remember, it's called the Virginia Company, right? And the Massachusetts Bay Company, and the Delaware Company, because colonies are economic enterprises. They weren't existing as safe havens for people who were religiously persecuted. They existed to make money for the crown. That's why you have a colony, for money. What can you extract from that place and then become a trading partner for the crown to make money, right? And then the royals have groups of investors that they send there, right? And so each colony is looking for its money-making scheme, right? And so they try to find gold, they come up short. They try to grow tropical fruits, that doesn't work, it's not the right climate. Right? They try sugar, that doesn't work. And they see Native Americans smoking something called tobacco, and they try it and they like it, and they think other people like this, right? And people still like this. So you have tobacco being the cash crop in the Chesapeake. In the north, you have the Dutch, then the English, and this is largely family farming, and then the business of slavery, which I'll talk about separately. And then in the low country, in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, it's English. This is a livestock, lumber, and cattle trade initially. And where is this livestock, lumber, and cattle going? To the West Indies, where you use all arable land for sugar production, so you import everything else. And they eventually notice a comfort food that enslaved people are growing. Enslaved women put rice in their braids because they didn't know where they're going, and they wanted to make sure that they had food. Because most of them were taken from the Windward Coast. And so they started growing small plots of rice. And their owners tried it. Their enslavers tried it, and they liked it, and they thought it was good, and they shared it with people, and it becomes the plantation system of that region. So North Carolina, South Carolina, that becomes rice country. There's just rice plantation after rice plantation after rice plantation. The lower Mississippi Valley, what we now refer to as Louisiana and Florida, was French, Spanish, and then American, right? And you have tobacco, sugar, and indigo there. Indigo is for blue dye, right? It's a plant you grow for blue dye, and it's also an import-export. So, you have these labor-hungry colonies. All of the colonies were in need of labor because people didn't want to go there. Because initially, more people died than survived when they went there. Because they didn't have proper preparation. They didn't know how cold it was going to be. They were unfamiliar with the agriculture. When indigenous people tried to tell them about agriculture, they told them they were wrong because they didn't like the way they grew things, like the three sisters, the corn, the beans, and the squash. They were like, oh, it's supposed to be in a row. And you guys grow it together, that's wrong. It actually grows really well together. Now people do that in their home gardens. But anyway, I digress. So, the first thing Europeans thought, the British thought that they were going to do is enslave native people. Right? And they had experience with this. I'm going to grab myself some water. Where did the English have experience in colonization before they came to North America?
Ireland.
Ireland. This is where the English learned how to colonize, right? And how to oppress large populations of people in Ireland. And so they thought they would do the same in Virginia. Okay, so we'll just use native labor. This does not work out well because the natives are strong enough to resist it, and they are dying by the thousands and then the hundreds of thousands. Disease, more than anything, led to the downfall of many native communities and kingdoms in North America. They got decimated by cold weather diseases that they had no familiarity with. And you combine that with guns and liquor, and native people are being pushed to the interior. And so within about 75 years, Europeans have relative control of the coast. Right? There are many wars and battles, but they have relative control of the coast by the time we get into the 17th century. Into the 18th century. And so, that doesn't work out as a major labor source. So they turn to another labor source, one they're really familiar with, indentured servants. European indentured servants. What's an indentured servant?
They're working for you've paid for them, you've paid their passage or whatever, so they're working for their...
They're so destitute that they can't even pay to go work, pay for their own passage to the New World. So somebody buys their indenture. This is usually for 7 years. Mm-hmm. After the 7 years, you're supposed to be given a bag of corn, some blankets, a set of clothes, and sometimes land, depending on where you're going and if there's land available and when you go. Most people are not surviving their indentures initially. So if we go back to Virginia, and the reason why I'm focusing in on Virginia is Virginia becomes the biggest and wealthiest colony in North America. It's no surprise that most of the founding fathers are from where? Virginia, right? Because this was the seat of economic and political power. So, you have mostly white indentured servants at first, right? And a few enslaved native people, and a few Africans who are referred to as both slaves and indentured servants in the same documents. Because there isn't a system of slavery yet. The laws about what slavery is haven't been written yet, right? It's going to be written, but it hasn't happened yet, right? So these new societies, these colonial enterprises, also are in the process of society creation. So they're making up what the rules are and what institutions are going to look like, right? And this year is actually the 400th anniversary of Africans in Jamestown. So Jamestown, Virginia is founded in 1607. You have a receipt for 20 Africans from 1619. There were probably some there before then, but that's the date that's usually used because that's where we have the bill of sale from, right? The receipt of the 20. Okay? I am going to go through one more slide and then we'll have a break. So, how do we get from mostly indentured servants, a few enslaved Native Americans and indentured servants, and a few enslaved and indentured servants of African descent to most Africans being enslaved and that being the primary labor system? How does that happen? One, everyone begins to live longer. So the colonists find better water sources, right? They start adding a little apple cider that's been fermented to their water. This is actually a really big deal because a lot of people weren't getting enough fresh water or they were getting contaminated water. So having a little alcohol in your water could make the difference for whether or not a community was making it. They figured out how long and harsh the winters can be. They've located native food stores and taken those over. They have figured out farming techniques to give themselves enough food. They've built proper shelters. And so people began to live longer. So not just free white folks, but also indentured servants begin to live longer. And so do people that are referred to both as slaves and servants. And the number of indentured servants begins to fall. Of course it does. Europe has been colonizing in the Americas for hundreds of years now. They've been pulling population from Europe for hundreds of years. So there are just literally less people available. And so indentured servants are getting more and more expensive. The Atlantic slave trade is expanding. And it becomes better business sense to buy someone for a lifetime rather than a number of years. But then you need a system that allows for a lifetime of servitude. And this is where you can go to the law. Now what happens in Virginia happens throughout the North American colonies. And versions of it had already happened in the West Indies and already happened in South America. But I like to take people through the steps to see how pigment becomes meaningful. It isn't anything mysterious. There was nothing natural about it. It was a completely artificial system that was created in the service of money. And so we can just follow it through the law. In 1662, children inherit the status of their mothers. Why is that weird in an English colony, in an English society at all?
It reverses primogeniture.
For millennia, children have inherited the status of their fathers. And now we have a society that goes, you're going to inherit the status of your mother. So whatever your mother was, so are you. So now slaves can be born. Okay? And then in 1670, blacks and Native Americans are forbidden from holding slaves. Okay? So the colonial legislature passes a law that says the only people who can hold other people as property are white people. So you make whiteness a requirement for mastery. Okay, now skin color is starting to mean something. 1680, 30 lashes to any, oh, I have a typo there, I see. Black or native person striking any white person. They used Christian to mean white, which was incorrect because there were black Christians, but anyway. Any black or native person striking any white person would have a special punishment. So now pigment is starting to mean something real in your life. It determines what you're going to be when you're born, how you're going to be treated if you do something like smack someone, right? Who can own another person. 1691, any white person who marries a black is banished. Banishment's a really big deal. It basically means you're going to die in the woods. If you are banished from town and the outlying farms, I hope that you can build a structure for yourself, cut down a tree, get some firewood, find some water source. Like, banishment is like, go die in the woods, right? So, that's the punishment. Whoa, why do this? And white women who had children with black men are indentured if they were free. And if you were already indentured, your indentured was extended. Why criminalize sex between white women and black men and not criminalize sex between white men and black women? Why only do it one way?
So you already reversed the primogenitor. You gotta make sure that the baby
Because
is black.
you inherit the status of your mother. So a black man who has a child with a white woman, that child is free. Like, so you don't want white and black people marrying, and you don't want them having children together. But if they are going to have children together, you're going to make sure it's only white men with black women. Because that child is a slave, and their father is their owner. Right? So this is an artificial system that was created. There's nothing natural about it. There was nothing inevitable about it. It was a thoughtful system that was created. You create race-based slavery. Right? And it's convenient. So like people of a certain shade, then you can mark them as slaves. 1705, white servants could only be whipped naked by order of the justice of the peace. So you're going to start protecting whiteness. Even if you're a lowly white servant, you're going to be protected in ways that black slaves are not. So whiteness becomes privilege. It becomes legally recognized privilege. Whiteness means you can own other people. Whiteness means that there is a level of treatment that has to be extended to you because you're white. So race is going to replace class. And so the poorest white person has something in common with the richest white person. They have a privilege that is not going to be extended to black and brown folks. And so now race is meaningful. And when you see this happening, I could do the same thing in Massachusetts. I could do the same thing in South Carolina. I could do the same thing in Georgia. I could do the same thing in New York. Right? These systems are created. What's different in the English systems than from like the Spanish and Portuguese is that they have a much larger spectrum of race, right? That they legally are acknowledging. So mixed race people have their own categories. The English have a one-drop rule. So somebody who may phenotypically, so the way they look white, could be enslaved and considered black. But that's why you also have to legislate these relationships. You don't want people race mixing, right? Because then that confuses the race-based system of slavery. And you ban interracial marriage. So there was no mystery. This was an intentional system that was created. There was nothing natural or inevitable about it. But after people have lived in this system a couple of generations, it becomes natural. Well, that's the way things are. So there must have been some driving reason behind it. That wasn't, and there wasn't. This was about money. So we'll stop there. Let's take like a 10-minute break. And then we'll come in entrenched throughout most of British North America. And I use this law from Rhode Island in 1703 to exemplify that. If any Negroes or Indians, either freemen, servants, or slaves, do walk the street of the town of Newport or any other town in this colony after 9 of the clock of the night, without a certificate from their masters or some English person of said family with them, or some lawful excuse for the same, that it shall be lawful for any person to take them up and deliver them to the constable. Anyone who is black or brown is suspect, whether they're free, whether they're a servant, or a slave. All black and brown people are suspect. All black and brown people are subject to special law, like this curfew. And when it says that it shall be lawful for any person to take them up and deliver them to the constable, who is any person? Any white person, right?
Yeah.
So all white people are responsible for surveilling all black and brown folks because they are suspect just because they're black or brown. This is before we're a nation.
Yeah.
Before we're a nation, black and brown folks are suspect, and all white people are responsible for surveilling them. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the business of slavery, because when we think about American slavery, most people think about vast plantations in the South. Those vast plantations in the South and in the West Indies did not exist in isolation. They were dependent upon the northern colonies, and the northern colonies were dependent upon them before and after the American Revolution. So, I'll give you the example of Rhode Island. In Rhode Island, farmers in the Narragansett grew livestock, so they raised livestock. They grew small amounts of wheat and corn. There was a large whaling industry for codfish. Do you think anybody in Europe wants their pork, wants their horses, wants their cattle, their wheat, their corn, their butter, or their codfish?
No.
Where is this going?
South.
It's going to the West Indies to feed the enslaved populations there. New England farmers, that we probably all learned about in K through 12, were growing food for slaves. Nobody in Europe wants their wheat and their corn and their carrots and their livestock, or their firewood. But West Indian sugar planters do, because it's cheaper for them to import food and use most of the arable land for sugar, right? Enslaved people in the West Indies usually had some kind of garden provision grounds, but the bulk of their food is coming from the northern colonies. During the American Revolution, there's famine throughout the West Indies because of British blockade, right? And they can't get food, right? And it takes a while to start growing your own, right? And what do Northerners get in exchange? They get a little bit of cash, which is really important because this is largely a barter economy, and they get molasses. Why is molasses important? What can you make with molasses? What do people in Europe love, and here? Liquor. Then and now is recession-proof, right? So what becomes, like we say that jokingly, but what is the number one export to Europe out of New England? Rum. That's the number one export out. And there is plenty of demand for it, right? So they're getting a little bit of cash, they're getting a little bit of molasses. In the city of Newport, there were 16 distilleries by the middle of the 18th century, right? Rum is also going to be used to purchase people in West Africa. So it operates as a currency. Now, if you're a barrel maker in Massachusetts, what do you have to do with slavery? Everything. Because that barrel that you're making to transport foodstuffs or rum in is being used in the business of slavery. If you are a wheat farmer in Connecticut, what do you have to do with slavery? Everything. Because your wheat is going to feed slave populations. If you're a sail maker, if you're a sailor, if you're in ironworks, you're making shackles for slave ships, right? You have an economy that is built around the business of slavery because plantations don't exist in isolation. And so to talk about slavery as if it's a Southern institution is just wrong. It doesn't exist in isolation. So we have this great American paradox, the simultaneous rise of liberty and freedom. And I don't have this figured out, and I don't think any scholar does. But we have some insights. Who's this? Okay, who's that? And that is James Madison, right? Have you ever heard of Richard Cupps?
No.
Richard Cupps was the enslaved man that was rented by Thomas Jefferson when he went to the First Continental Congress.
Say that again.
He was the enslaved man who was rented by Thomas Jefferson when he went to the First Continental Congress, because he didn't want to infect because he has hundreds of slaves, but he didn't want them, these are his words, infected with talk of liberty. But he can't do without without a manservant, so he rents one, right? And he's called Richard Cups because he's serving him tea the entire time. So when we think about the founding of the nation, about the Declaration of Independence, about the Continental Congress, we don't think about people like Richard Cups that are literally in the room filling up his teacup, right? Which is why it's called Richard Cups. This, and the red hat, gentleman in the red hat, that is William Lee. Anybody ever heard of William Lee? William Lee is George Washington's manservant. Usually when you see this picture, it's cropped, so you don't see him. He accompanied George Washington to every single revolutionary battle, and we've erased him from history. There are hundreds of portraits of him because he was always with the general. He was enslaved. And then we have Paul Jennings, who was enslaved by James Madison, and James Madison asked him during the Revolutionary period if he would like his freedom, thinking he would say no because he thought he treated him so well. He said yes. But why am I doing this? To remind us that these people that we know so well had slaves. And so it's not surprising that they create a slaveholding republic, that they create a document that protects and supports the institution of slavery. Of course they did. That's what politicians do. 2/3 of all of the founding fathers held people. 2/3 of the founding fathers were slaveholders. And so they created a document that protected slavery. And it wasn't just about economics for them. It was the only social system that they thought could work. Slavery was normal and natural to them, right? That's what they grew up knowing. And so when I say that they supported slavery, that the Constitution is a pro-slavery document, this is usually when I get gas from students like, she's called the Constitution a pro-slavery document. This is not my opinion. It's a statement of fact, right? So if you read the Constitution, which I make my students do, we say hate, and then they say thank you for making us read that. The word slavery doesn't appear. Institution of slavery doesn't appear. Bondage doesn't appear. These were not dumb men. You know, they wrote that out. We have the older versions, right? And they edited that out. They didn't want slave in their freedom document. And so they edited it out. And instead, they just refer to the institution. They say, those who owe others service, right? Who are people who owe others service? That's a slave, but they don't want to say slave, right? And so they refer to the institution rather than stating it. But first we have the 3/5 clause. Now, a lot of people get up in arms because enslaved people were counted as 3/5 of a person. Yes, that in and of itself is offensive. But the 3/5 clause was political, right? So every state, no matter how many people live in that state, get 2 senators, right? Whether it's North Dakota or California, they both have 2 senators. But the number of Congress people is determined by, this is all in the news right now with the census, right? It's determined by the total number of people in that state. So New York has a lot more Congress people than Wisconsin, right? Because they have a lot more people. So being able to count enslaved people as 3/5 of a person is really important in places like Virginia, where slaves count for 40% of the population. Or in Georgia, where they account for 38% of the population. Or in South Carolina, the only state that has a black majority, where they account for 60% of the population. But in most southern states, it's hovering around 40% of the population is enslaved. So this is a huge deal. This is about outside political power. That's why they want the 3/5 clause, to make sure that they have outside political power. And when I say outside, I mean, nobody is representing the interest of enslaved people, right? But they're being counted as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes. Then you have the fugitive slave law. The fugitive slave law says that if you are enslaved in North Carolina and you run away to New Hampshire that abolished slavery after the American Revolution, you're still a slave, and the officials in New Hampshire have a legal responsibility to return you to North Carolina. That a slave anywhere in the U.S. is a slave everywhere in the U.S. A fugitive slave clause. So those who owe service to one in one state will owe service to another in another state for those that do not recognize those who hold others. For, like, the legalese is astounding. But that's what it goes down to, right? Then you have the 1808 slave trade law. This is my favorite. If you haven't figured it out, I'm sarcastic. It usually takes my students a couple of weeks, like when I tell them about my favorite slave law, I'm like, clearly, I have a favorite slave law. But the 1808 slave trade law says that there can be no discussion of America ending its participation in the Atlantic slave trade until 1808. When is the Constitution ratified? 1787, right? So they want 20 years of unfettered access to the Atlantic slave trade. It can't even be brought up for discussion until 1808. So a little backstory. By the 1780s, there is a very small and burgeoning abolitionist movement among white folks. Black people have been pushing to destroy the institution from the beginning. But there's a small burgeoning abolitionist movement coming up. And one of the things that they talk most about are the horrors of the slave trade. And it's because insurance companies have figured out and published how many people can die per voyage and there still be a profit made. Right? This is abhorrent, right? And so there's talk of different nations pulling out, well, different kingdoms and nations pulling out of the slave trade. The Founding Fathers want to make sure that they have unfettered access for at least 20 years. During the American Revolution, 1 in 5 slaves escapes. Because as soon as there's chaos, enslaved people look at any avenue to get away. And a good chunk of black men go and fight for the British in exchange for their freedom. So the number of enslaved people in the United States has diminished. And so they have to have access to, and in their words, refill their coffers, right? So they need more access. And this passes, like, you can't even talk about it until 1808, right? So it's not my opinion that this is a pro-slavery document, it just is. And then there's the Northwest Ordinance. We're in the Northwest Ordinance, or what was the Northwest Ordinance, and they said there's not going to be slavery here. There was. They ignored the law, but that's a whole nother lecture. But when you say where something can't be, you're also saying where it can be, right? And the Founding Fathers already had their eyes on the Pacific, from sea to sea, right? And race is going to continue to matter at the federal level. Our very first immigration law, right, and we spend a lot of time talking about immigration right now, our very first immigration law was racist to its core. The very first law of this country passed about immigration, written by Thomas Jefferson in 1790, said if you're going to be a naturalized citizen, you got to be white. Again, it's not my opinion that just is. That the only people who can become naturalized citizens of the United States of America are white people. This is not overturned until 1952. America was conceived as a white free nation. That's how the Founding Fathers understood it. This is a free nation for white people. Native people are outside of it, and black people are oppressed within it. And free black people are not citizens. They couldn't get passports. They were stateless. We've been racist from our beginning. That is very difficult for some people to come to terms to, but that's just the truth of it. From our very beginning, we were racist. We were racist before we were ever a country. And when we became a formal country, we adopted that racism. The Constitution is also a freedom document. It isn't either or, right? And put in the context of what was happening in the rest of the Western world, it seemed absolutely insane, right? And everyone thought it was going to fall apart and it was never going to work. Like, you can't have a country without a monarchy and a strict hierarchy and a class structure. That's not going to work. It's all going to fall apart, right? And you can't guarantee all of these rights and tell people that they can have a lawyer if they can't afford it and tell them why they're being arrested. Like, that seemed insane, right? That wouldn't work, right? And it was Bessie on purpose. And sometimes we get very frustrated with Washington not getting things done. It was intentional. We create 3 branches of government, none more powerful than the other. So if they don't work together, then they just don't work. It was created by design to create that kind of lockdown. If you won't work together, you don't work. Because we have 3 separations, no one is more powerful than the other. You get the executive, you get one with the purse strings, you get one that decides the law. Okay. And if you don't all work together, it doesn't work. What I most appreciate about the Constitution, the reason I read it to my kids every 4th of July, is that it is a living thing. The Founding Fathers had many, many flaws, but they did not think they knew it all. And I have great respect for that. They created a document that could change with the people. So the same document that protects and supports race-based slavery becomes the same document that destroys it. We have a constitution that means we don't have to live with the mistakes of our ancestors. That means that we don't have to carry on the legacies of oppression that we were born with. It's a high bar, it's difficult to do, but we have a living, breathing document that can change with the people. We can decide what it looks like, how it operates. Okay? They didn't think they knew it all, and they did not make themselves kings, and they could have. Especially George Washington. Okay? And he declines to run for that 3rd time, and does not make himself king. Free blacks are loyal to this document. One, a number of blacks, about 1/5 of the population of black people fought in the American Revolution. Right? So they were patriots. And they think that it comes up short, but that it's their best avenue toward freedom. And they sue for their rights, quoting the Constitution. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. One of the successful ones was Mum Bet, who used the Massachusetts state constitution to argue that she should be a free woman, right? So the Massachusetts state constitution was modeled on the U.S. Constitution. She is in the Ashley household, one of the most powerful politically and economically households in Massachusetts, and she is serving tea while the Constitution is being written by her enslaver and his friends. And she's paying attention. She's out running errands, which she commonly did for the family, finds out about an abolitionist lawyer, sues for her freedom according to the U.S. and Massachusetts Constitution, and she wins. And that's how slavery falls apart in Massachusetts. Now, you have enslaved people doing this in all of the 13 states. It only worked in Massachusetts because there were 2 quirky judges on the state Supreme Court. But I digress. So, we have a slaveholding republic from 1787 to 1865. 2 separate things happen. Slavery begins to fall apart really slowly in the North. And it fits and starts, and it's protracted, and there is no real rhyme or reason to it. Well, there's a reason, but no rhyme to it. And the opposite happens in the South. Slavery expands. So in the North, it begins to fall apart. In the South, it expands. I find that most of my students have no idea how slavery fell apart in the North. Like it just disappeared on a horizon or something. It falls apart in the North in a variety of ways. One is military service. Most of the northern regiments offered freedom in exchange for service. And so you have black men fighting in nearly every northern state for the Patriots. So that begins to eat at slavery. That and enslaved people only represented about 5% of the population of the North. The vast majority of enslaved people were in the South. And this is because of plantations, not because Northerners were nice. It just didn't make any sense from an agricultural point of view. So no regiments in the South offered freedom in exchange for service. No way were they doing that, because enslaved people were like 30, 40, 50% of the population. No. In a place where they're 5, yeah. They weren't going to put guns in their hands. You also have massive running away. You have self-purchase. You have people suing for their freedom, petitions for abolition, and gradual emancipation. How many people have heard of gradual emancipation? A couple of you. So gradual emancipation reflected the breakdown of slavery. It didn't lead to the breakdown of slavery. And I'll explain what I mean by that. It reflected it. So I'll tell you one I know by heart. This is from Rhode Island. Children born before March 1st to enslaved mothers will not be enslaved, but indentured to their mother's master until they reach their maturity. They were reflecting already the breakdown of slavery. The writing was on the wall. The institution wasn't going to survive. But you can see these emancipation dates. Pennsylvania, 1808, Connecticut, 1805, Rhode Island, 1802, New York, 1824, New Jersey. And those were the first dates of emancipation when people were born, 1825. And then you see the abolition of slavery everywhere except New Jersey never abolished slavery until the Civil War. So, how do I know that gradual emancipation was a reflection of, not the cause of? Pay attention to those first emancipation dates, 1808 through 1825. Now look at the numbers of free black people by 1810. Most were free by 1810. Those are the first emancipation dates. So gradual emancipation laws reflect the breakdown of slavery. What caused the breakdown of slavery? Pushback by enslaved black people in the North. They were able to do it because what was most important in the North was not the labor of enslaved people, but the business of slavery. It wasn't their labor now their labor was important, it enriched people, but it wasn't the center of the economy. The center of the economy was the business of slavery, not the labor of enslaved people. Now, enslaved folks in the South are doing the same thing, and it's not resulting in things like the gradual emancipation laws because their labor is the center of the economy. And so in the North, it starts to fall apart. In the South, exactly the opposite happens. Because you can see by 1820, the vast majority are free. The U.S. is empire building in the 19th century. So the United States goes from being this narrow band of states along the northeastern coast to this sprawling empire. How does this happen? You get the Louisiana Purchase, right, which more than doubles the size of the United States, right? You get the annexation of Mississippi and Alabama, and then in 1848, Mexican secession. And the people who woke up in 1848 woke up forever immigrants, and remember, they can't become naturalized citizens because they're not white. So they become stateless people. This makes the immigration debate look really different when you know this history. It sounds absurd when you know this history, right? And why does Mexico cede all of that land? Because we have a bunch of guns pointed at their capital. So that's how America takes on its shape, what it looks like now. Now, were indigenous folks in these areas? This is empire building. Most Americans don't think of themselves as being part of an empire, but we still have territories. Where are our territories? Puerto Rico is our territory. Who's their representative and what power do they have? I'm not being facetious. We forget about this. Do they pay income tax though? 'Cause they do, right? Guam, American Samoa. We have colonies.
U.S. Virgin Islands.
We just call them territories because that sounds better than calling them colonies. Or we're their protectorates, right? But this is a longer tradition of American empire building. So this is how, and slavery is going to expand to most of this land, right? This is the Deep South. This is where all those cotton plantations come into play. So how does cotton become the, there is no commercial growing of cotton until after the American Revolution. During the American Revolution, because trade with Great Britain breaks down, of course, because you don't trade with people that you're at war with, right? Americans can't get clothing, because that was something they imported from the mother country. And so they're growing small bits of cotton themselves to literally clothe themselves, right? And so, but nobody wanted to grow it commercially because it didn't make any sense. Because the kind of cotton you can grow in the United States is this short staple seedy cotton. And it would take one person an entire day, about 10 hours, to remove all the seeds from 1 pound of cotton. So there was no commercial future in it, right? And even now, if you go to like the home store, TJ Maxx or Kohl's, you'll notice that Egyptian cotton costs a whole lot more than American cotton because it's that long staple and it has very few seeds in it and it's a lot softer. So this American cotton, there was no commercial market for it because it took so long to remove the seeds, and it was a short staple cotton rather than a long cotton. The cotton gin is going to change that because the cotton gin combs the cotton and takes the seeds out. So now it becomes commercially viable. And so the first cotton gins could, in a day, gin about 100 pounds of cotton. So it goes from being not commercially viable to extremely commercially viable. And it explodes. But this cotton explosion makes the business of slavery even more important in the North. Because when you think about the Industrial Revolution and the Textile Revolution, what are they milling in all of those mills? Slave-grown cotton. So the expansion of free labor is dependent upon slave labor. In factories that are creating farming implements like hoes and rakes and plows, what are they creating those farming implements for? To be used where? On cotton plantations. What banks have enough credit to lend people to buy land from the government? They're in New York and Philadelphia. Before it's the New York Stock Exchange, it's just the cotton exchange. Right? Cotton becomes the American economy. By the time we get to the middle of the 19th century, cotton accounts for 58% of all U.S. exports. We have nothing even close to that. 58%. And you know what was second? Tobacco. And you know what was grown by enslaved people? And what's third? Rice. Right? So cotton, tobacco, rice. So when you hear someone say something like, America was built off the back of black slaves, that's just a true statement. Like, people aren't trying to be incendiary or like provocative. Just go look at our import-export records from the 19th century. This is how America becomes an economic powerhouse. By the middle of the 19th century, if someone in the Western world was wearing cotton, 2/3 of them were wearing cotton that was picked by an enslaved person in the American South. It becomes the economy. And then you have something called Negro cloth that was made especially for enslaved people who would destroy their clothing as a point of protest. It's this coarse cotton wool material that cleans easily, is really strong, and you can wear it all the time, and everybody in this room has a pair. This is the precursor to it. This is the jeans, right? Where did Levi Strauss buy their patent from? A Negro cloth mill in Rhode Island. Because jeans were made to be work clothes. Now it's just ubiquitous American fashion. But it started off as slave clothes. I just want to give you a sense of the growth, right? So where are these enslaved people coming from? Primarily from the Old South, being sold to the New South. In 1808, there is a slave trade law passed. Americans cannot participate in the slave trade. It goes underground. The estimates are about 100,000 people are brought in illegally. But what this does was shoot up the price of enslaved people because you can no longer get access to new people, right? Unless you're doing it underground, which people were doing it. But you can see the populations of enslaved people decline in the Old South and increase in the New South, right? As they're being sold away because tobacco land is greatly depleted. You can see the numbers of, look at the population growth in the New South of enslaved people. And we're growing by tens and 20s and hundreds of thousands of people. The people that are sold in the slave trade, most of them are between the ages of about 15 and 25. 1 million people are sold in the domestic slave trade. That's more people that were imported in the Atlantic slave trade. 1 million people are sold in the domestic slave trade. Okay. People of all ages are sold, but the prime age is 15 to 25. Why them? Because you survived childhood diseases and you filled out, right? And you got a life ahead of you. Enslaved people called them the disappeared. This creates madness and anxiety in slave communities. Everybody knew somebody who had been sold. And you don't know when this is happening. You're not given a heads up, right? Your family member is gone. Your brother, your sister, your uncle, your cousin, your loved one. They're just gone. And you're disappeared because it's not like you're going to see them at Christmas or at a birthday. And you don't know what happens to them, and you don't know where they go. It takes no imagination at all to think of the anxiety and horror and depression that would cause throughout a community for people to just be disappeared. And for the person who's sold, where are you going? Is there going to be anybody there friendly? What kind of work are you going to do? This was a horror show. America has a long history of separating families. It's not new. I'm not trying to be political. Because at the same time this was happening, Native Americans were being put into boarding schools, separating families. When people say this is not who we are, that's a lie. This is exactly who we are. And we have a long history of doing this. The last boarding schools for Native Americans were shuttered in the 1970s. This is exactly who we are. And we have a long history of doing this. And we need to take a long look in the mirror and ask what that says about us. And who we are and what we allow to happen in our name. Okay. I want to give you a sense of the population. This is the South. The census had 3 categories until the end of until after the Civil War. There were 3 categories: white, free non-white, and slave. That was it. All right, so we don't know how many Asians, because they're all just put in the free non-white category. As you can see, enslaved people are vastly outnumbered in the South. It's usually 2 to 1. So, how do you keep, by 1860, 4 million people in bondage? There is no nice way to exploit someone's labor every hour of every day. Just like there's no nice way to rape someone. I can't rape somebody and go, well, I bought you an ice cream after. As if that erases the horror of what happened to you. There's no nice way to keep people in bondage. There's no such thing as benevolent slavery. That was made up to make white people feel better. How do you keep thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, and then millions of people in bondage. You do it through overwhelming force. So what's your name, ma'am?
Sarah.
So if I want to enslave Sarah in this period, it's not just my ability to be stronger than her, drag her to my basement and keep her locked up there. It's my ability to call the McFarland police if she runs away and they bring her back. And then if she plans stuff with other people, then the Governor Evers can call the state guard out. That's how you do it. You do it through overwhelming force. It's not like one person is just stronger than another and they keep these people in bondage. It's a system. So if you think about a plantation, you have a system. You have the enslavers that call themselves the master and the mistress. You have an overseer. An overseer gets their name because they're literally overseeing the fields. They're on horseback with a gun. You have drivers, people that are walking up and down the field lines with whips to make sure people are working at pace, right? And then you have workers. And you have a slave patrol. The vast majority of Southern whites never owned a slave. But most Southern white men worked a slave patrol. Slave patrols were 24/7. Plantation sounds nice sometimes. It's an open air prison. That's how you keep people in bondage. And then you make laws around it. And then you make the power of the state available to those people who hold those in bondage. That's how you do it. You do it through overwhelming force. This is what slavery looks like. It's whipping post, it's humiliations, it's torture. This woman is holding an iron kettle on her head, and she's also being shamed by having her breast bared, and she has to stand uneven. He has on an iron mask. You know, these are pot hooks for people who run away. The first time you run away, it's usually a branding. The next time is the losing of a finger or toes. And then the next time is the losing of a hand or a limb. This is how slavery works. And all of this is done publicly. Why? Because it serves a purpose. So is every person beaten all the time? No. If I want to control this room, I only have to really mess up about 2 of you and have monopoly on firepower, and I will control this room. That's how this works. And I don't show people this to make them feel bad or queasy. That's how slavery worked. It wasn't like you're just really good at convincing people to not get any money for their labor, right? It's about force. So the picture of the whipped man is one of the most popular. He was advertised as particularly willful. Like his scars have scars. Right? How do you get people to pick 200 pounds of cotton a day? You torture them. That's how you do it. Give you a sense of what slavery looked like mid-century. Most people are cultivating cotton. Most white Southerners have no dream of holding a slave. This is a small club. And of slaveholders that are about 24% of the population, only 1% of that 24% holds more than 100 people. So when you see like a Hollywood movie and there's somebody who holds hundreds of slaves, that would be like now people who have a small yacht to carry the toys for their big yacht. This is a very small group of people. The people who owned 100 or more slaves, there was about 1,200 of them. And they intermarried like crazy and wrote letters to each other all the time. And kept diaries. So we have intimate knowledge of what they were thinking about. I often think when I assign like these different experts in diaries, these people had no idea. Hundreds of years from now, students would be sitting around reading their most intimate thoughts. And it always surprises me, like, I'm like, if my family member ruled, I would have burned this. I would have. It's amazing what people admit. But that's how it worked, right? That's what slavery looked like. You can't understand American capitalism if you don't understand slavery. They are one and the same. They are 2 interdependent systems. They fed off each other. And it's really been within the past 25 years that economists have come to terms with this. Historians have been saying this for since the middle of the 20th century, but it's really been only the past 25 years. The economists have come to to terms with this because we want to think about capitalism as being post-slavery, right? A system that emerges after slavery that is based on wage labor. But the wage labor system that is created in the 19th century, as we've talked about, is directly tied to slave labor. They are one and the same, especially when we're talking about financial instruments like lines of credit and mortgaging and insuring things. So, when I was in school, I hated history. And if you had told me I would be a historian, I would have laughed at you because I had to memorize a bunch of dates and facts. But more than that, it didn't seem real to me and it didn't tell me anything about my world. But why I really hated it was, you know, for a day or two out of every year, they would talk about slavery and I wanted to die. Because I was in a predominantly white school and everyone would look at me and they would talk about how downtrodden and abused the slaves were, and then they would like move on to talk about the greatness of the Industrial Revolution. African Americans were oppressed by slavery. They were not destroyed by it, and they fought it all the time. They resisted their bondage. I was in graduate school before I was ever taught that they were fighting an uphill battle against an overwhelming force, and yet they still fought back, and they were not destroyed by slavery. How can I so definitively say African Americans were not destroyed by slavery? Well, destroyed people don't create culture. Destroyed people don't write music. Destroyed people don't create the first purely American form of music, which is the call and response. If you talk to a musicologist and ask them about European music, there is no call and response. There never has been. And you really don't hear it in West African music. You hear it among enslaved people. They created work songs and they created spiritual songs, right? That's not something destroyed people do. And while their families are being torn apart in the domestic slave trade, what is the response of African Americans? They have this elaborate adoption system that just becomes part of African American culture. When I was growing up, and I still to this day, I had aunts who I found out weren't my grandmother's children, like her natural children, at her funeral because they weren't in the program. And I was like, well, why isn't Aunt Zetta in the program? They were like, oh, that was her daughter, that's not really her daughter. I was like, what do you mean? Of course that's her daughter, right? The African American community's response to their families being torn apart was to adopt people and treat them like family when they weren't family. And slaveholders wrote about this all the time. They said, these people are crazy. They treat people who are of no relation to them as if they're blood. We brought some people into their community and they just accepted them. They saw it as a critique, like, these are weird people who don't understand how family works, right? So the response of the African American community to this horror of separation was to make family out of people who weren't family, to the point that people would forget that they weren't family. Destroyed people don't do that, right? Destroyed people don't take the scraps of food they're given and make it into an incredible cuisine. Those are not the actions of destroyed people. Destroyed people don't spend 3 hours cooking after being in a field all day to give something good to somebody they love, right? So slavery oppressed Black people. It did not destroy them, and they did not accept their bondage. And we know they don't accept their bondage because you have whipping posts on every plantation, because you have prison pens on every plantation, because slave catching is a profession, right? Because you have this elaborate punishment system for everything. Because when you read a planter's journal, it is a litany of complaints of all the things that enslaved people do. what they stole, what they burned down, the crops that they ruined. Black people never accepted their bondage, and they never quit fighting. But when I was taught slavery, I wasn't taught that. And so I was made to feel small and inadequate and stupid. Because why am I a part of this group of people that just accepted their bondage? And they just got crapped on and just, okay. They never did. They never gave in. I'm going to end with a little bit of the Civil War. African Americans were instrumental in securing their own freedom. And again, this is not my opinion. We often focus on the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. We pay a lot less attention to what happened before that. So when the war breaks out, the fight is not over whether or not slavery should exist. The fight is over whether or not slavery is going to expand, right? Is it going to move west? That's the fight. Not over its existence, but whether or not slavery is going to move west. One primary source I always use when I teach the Civil War is I'm blanking on his name. The mayor of New York wanted to secede because he was like, we can't make it without the South. That's where all of our financial investment is. Our number one trading good is cotton. Like, we're not going to be able to make it without them, right? Right? All those dock workers, what were they shipping out? Cotton, right? So, but I digress. So the fight was over the expansion of slavery west. Was the West going to be free states or slave states? That's what the fight is over. And when the South secedes, the North has one goal: to reunify the country, not to end slavery. And we know this because Lincoln said this over and over and over again. Not to mention, when black men showed up to fight for the Union, they were turned away. Right? The Union did not accept black soldiers until 1863, even though they turned out in massive numbers throughout the North to fight. But also what is happening in the South. When the war begins, wherever the outbreak is happening, the first thing that happens is the slave patrols start to fall apart. Because those are the same men who are being conscripted into the army, right? And when the slave patrols start to fall apart, enslaved people begin to run. And what do they run to? Union lines. They run to Union lines and offer information and their help. And so there's these great letters between Lincoln and General Butler, where General Butler's like, they keep coming. They're offering us information and their bodies. And he's like, to turn them away is like giving the enemy their gun after they've dropped it. Right? Finally, Lincoln's convinced. Finally, Congress is convinced, and you get the first Confiscation Act. The first Confiscation Act made runaway slaves contraband of the Union Army. And then they still keep coming, and they come as families. The second Confiscation Act makes the families free, right? So we focus on the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was the third step, right? And it was a reaction to what enslaved people were doing in the South. There was an estimated 4 million enslaved people at the beginning of the Civil War. We have ads for 500,000 that run away. Think how many we don't have. Right? So black people were not waiting to be liberated. They liberated themselves and offered their services. You know, Harriet Tubman becomes a spy for the Union Army. And one of their most successful ones, because everybody discounts her because they think that she's just some homeless old lady who's roaming around. Right? Black people are instrumental in their own freedom. This is, his last name is Smalls.
Robert Smalls.
Robert Smalls. How many people know about Robert Smalls? How this isn't a Hollywood movie is beyond me. So Smalls is an enslaved man in South Carolina who is forced to work for the Confederacy on the docks. He steals their boat well, not their boat, their ship, and delivers it to the Union Army and then tells them all their plans. These are not passive people who are just waiting to be free, right? African Americans are incredibly instrumental in their own freedom. And then in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation also allows black men to serve in the Union Army, and there were more than they could process. There's a backlog in the processing of black soldiers. And they volunteered for the deadliest battles, because for them, this wasn't about political freedom. This wasn't about the reunification of a country. This was about their actual freedom as humans. This is when the tide in the war changes. This is when the Confederacy goes on its heels. Frederick Douglass was always telling Lincoln that he was fighting this war with a strong right hand behind his back. Okay. Let people who have everything to lose fight and see what happens. So American slavery is central to understanding American history. But it's important that students know that African Americans were oppressed by slavery, but they were not destroyed by it. Thank you for your time.